vat of porter burst, and the beer ran in torrents through the streets.
A wall of liquid thunder smashed through brick and timber in seconds. On the evening of October 17, 1814, inside the Horse Shoe Brewery on Tottenham Court Road in London, something catastrophic had just happened. More than 320,000 gallons of porter beer erupted from the brewery storehouse. The pressure triggered a chain reaction as nearby vats collapsed one after another. Barrels split, walls shattered, brick buildings burst outward like they had been struck by artillery. Outside, in the crowded slum of St. Giles, residents heard the sound first. Then they saw the wave. A 15-foot-high surge of dark beer blasted through the neighborhood, tearing through houses, flooding basements, and trapping families inside their rooms. By the time the torrent slowed, 8 people were dead. But the catastrophe had been predicted, almost casually, and the only warning had been a single, broken metal ring. The Different Shoe Brewery was not a small operation. Owned by Mew and Company, it was one of the largest porter breweries in London, producing enormous quantities of dark beer for a city that drank porter by the gallon. The brewing vats themselves were engineering monuments. Some stood 2 stories tall. Each was reinforced with giant iron hoops designed to contain the immense outward pressure created during fermentation. Together they held hundreds of thousands of gallons of beer at any given time. But on the afternoon of October 17th, a small warning appeared. Inside the brewery storehouse, clerk George Crick noticed something unusual. One of the iron hoops securing a massive vat had snapped. The metal ring had fallen from the wooden structure. Crick did exactly what procedure required. He reported it. The message went to his supervisor, and the response came back quickly.
No harm whatever.
The broken hoop, he was told, could simply be written down and repaired the next day. Hoops had fallen from vats before. It was not considered dangerous. So the note was logged. Work continued. But the broken ring had revealed something no one fully understood. The vat was already under enormous internal pressure, and the structural system holding it together had just begun to fail. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. Workers moved through the brewery. Barrels were stacked. Fermentation continued quietly in the towering vats. Then, without warning, the vat exploded. Not cracked, not leaked, exploded. The enormous wooden vessel ruptured with such force that its remaining iron hoops were blown outward. The collapse instantly destabilized other nearby vats filled with fermenting porter. One after another, they failed. Wood splintered, iron tore loose. More vats burst open under the sudden surge of pressure. Within seconds, 320,000 gallons of beer surged into the brewery storehouse. But the building could not contain it. The torrent smashed through the brick exterior wall. The wall collapsed outward, and the beer poured directly into the densely packed alleys of St. Giles. The streets there were narrow. The houses were crowded together, and many families lived in basement rooms below street level. The wave struck them first. Witnesses later described the moment in terms that conveyed both force and disorientation. One American visitor wrote,
"A roar, as of fallen buildings at a distance, and suffocating fumes were in my ears and nostrils. All at once I found myself borne onward with great velocity by a torrent which burst upon me so suddenly as almost to deprive me of breath."
Homes collapsed under the pressure. Cellars filled instantly. People inside had almost no time to escape. In one nearby house, a mother and daughter were drinking tea when the wall of beer crashed through the building. Both were killed. In another dwelling, the flood filled the basement so quickly that several occupants were trapped below ground. Some drowned. Others were crushed as weakened structures collapsed. The wave tore through the neighborhood before finally dispersing into the streets and drainage channels of London. When the liquid finally settled, 8 people had died. Many others were injured. Entire homes had been reduced to wreckage, and the streets of St. Giles were soaked in beer. Inside the brewery, the destruction was just as shocking. The giant vats that had dominated the building were now shattered fragments. Wooden staves lay splintered across the floor. Iron hoops were twisted and scattered like shrapnel. One of the first to witness the aftermath inside the brewery was the same clerk who had reported the broken hoop. George Crick later described what he saw.
I was on a platform about 30 feet from the vat when it burst. I heard the crash as it went off and ran immediately to the storehouse. It caused dreadful devastation on the premises. It knocked 4 butts over and staved several, as the pressure was so excessive.
Outside, the destruction extended far beyond the brewery walls. Newspapers attempted to capture the scale of what had happened. One report described the aftermath in stark terms.
The surrounding scene of desolation presents a most awful and terrific appearance, equal to that which fire or earthquake may be supposed to occasion.
Another account described the human cost in even more immediate language.
The cries and the groans which issued from the ruins were dreadful. The impetuosity of the torrent was such as to break through the wall and to force up the floors.
The disaster had taken seconds, but it had begun hours earlier, with a warning that seemed insignificant. A single broken ring. At the time, brewery staff believed the system was safe. Iron hoops had fallen off vats before. The vats were enormous, and they had stood for years. But the assumption hiding inside that decision would prove fatal, because the broken hoop had not been the problem. It had been the symptom. What no one inside the brewery fully understood was how much pressure those towering vats were holding, or how little margin for failure existed once the structure began to weaken. When the first vat ruptured, the entire building became a chain reaction. And London would only realize the scale of that danger after the flood had already swept through St. Giles. But one question lingered over the disaster. The warning had been seen, it had been reported, and it had been dismissed. If the warning had been taken seriously, would the London beer flood have happened at all?